Two and a Half Admins, episode 197. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Linux maintainers were infected for 2 years by SSH dwelling backdoor with huge reach.
So the infrastructure that's used to maintain and distribute the Linux operating system kernel itself, it turns out to have been infected probably starting in around 2009 and left there for quite a while afterwards. The sophisticated malware managed to get a hold of what the article describes as developers' most closely guarded resource, the etc shadow file, which contains encrypted password data, although actually the shadow file contains hashed passwords, not encrypted. But I'd also say the more guarded resource would be SSH keys, like the private key, rather than the password file.
Dear listeners, you couldn't see Alan's scare quotes when he said encrypted, but trust me, they were there.
Yeah. So passwords are hashed, although in this case, it doesn't actually matter, especially back then, if they were still using something like MD5 crypt for the passwords, or even if they were using something newer. When you have a copy of the shadow file from a machine, you can use tools like John the Ripper and new GPU accelerated versions of it, although I don't think this GPU acceleration was quite as big of a thing back in 2009.
Rainbow tables were, though.
Yeah, rainbow tables were, but those didn't work with salted hashes that would be in a shadow file. You would be able to, given enough time, sit there and brute force until you cracked those passwords and then be able to log in as those users on kernel.org. While, because you did the hacking with John offline, it never showed any failed logins attempts. You would just show up and log in with the right password the first time.
And let's be honest, a lot of those passwords would not have taken that much effort to crack with an automated tool like that, because while I'm sure many kernel developers are security-focused folks who make sure to always use strong passphrases, I guarantee you there's going to be a bunch of them. They're like, I have to type this thing 1,000,000 times a day. It's going to be short and sweet and easy.
Yep. And also, if they manage to get malware into SSHD, then they could probably see your password when you typed it. And raises other questions about why are you logging in with a password, not an SSH key?
So hang on, this sounds like it should be this huge story that everyone is talking about, but it seems like whoever compromised them didn't really do much with this access, right?
They apparently didn't really know what the hell they had, and they just treated them like any other random machines and used them to send spam.
Yeah, because this could have been like really, really serious. It could have made the XZ thing look like nothing.
I would love to believe that some malware jackass somewhere recognizes that he was the one who had access to the kernel developers' systems for like 2 years and didn't realize it at the time. It's just sitting there like, crap.
What was interesting is that it seems there was something else maybe happening at the same time. If you remember back in 2011 when this came to light, the maintainers had made a promise to do an autopsy of the hack and reveal some stuff. But it turns out they never did that. The kind of insider stuff I heard is that they found more than just that malware. It seems there was actually a persistent malware that meant even if you replace the disks in the machine, it would just reinfect itself.
Well, malware is a lot like Pringles. You know, once you pop, you can't stop.
Yeah.
You're not going to just have one piece generally. If malware is on your machine for long, it's going to invite its friends.
Yeah. I mean, I think in particular, it sounded like there was maybe a state actor involved in one of those compromises. And the rumor I heard is that a couple of those kernel.org machines were like locked in a cabinet somewhere because they still wanted to be able to look at them, but they didn't want them touching the internet ever again. And then so ESET did a report in 2014 about some of what happened. And then in a recent thing, they published a paper about the 15-year history of that particular malware and talked about how that all worked. In particular, that they managed to compromise something like 400,000 servers, almost all running Linux, although they did manage to get a couple of FreeBSD servers, a couple dozen OpenBSD servers, and even a couple of Sonos machines, and at least one Mac.
Interestingly, that's also roughly the correct time frame for the one time that I absolutely got rolled up like a rug and had to reinstall literally every single client system I'd ever touched because I found out somebody had nailed me with a password-stealing Trojan version of SSH. And once they got me on one machine, they followed me around everywhere and got all of them because I had not learned all of the OPSEC lessons then that I have now.
Do you think it was a case of back then people were just less aware of the OPSEC stuff?
I certainly was, but I don't think anybody ever really gets fully aware of the OPSEC stuff, so to speak, until they've personally been burned. I mean, you can have a good idea, but it's just one of those things that like you don't ever really get it until you have that sickening realization that somebody has logged in to other systems with your computer from your house and done stuff with your login. It's just it's a violation. It does not feel good, and it will absolutely change the way that you think and behave around computers.
Yeah, like that shit can give you nightmares. One I happened to me is one time went down to the shared Windows workstation at the office that was used to remote control in from other machines to get on like IPMI and remote management and so on. And the mouse is moving and somebody's doing something and it's not one of us. It's like, okay, so somebody's compromised the RDP on that and oh, look what they're doing. Yeah, rip that machine plug right out of the wall and spend the rest of the week paranoid about everything.
Do you guys remember when VNC roulette was a thing?
Yep.
Right about the time that site came out, my best friend at the time, he had installed VNC on his home computer, no password, and just port forwarded it straight to the internet. And I was horrified, and I tried to tell him what a terrible idea that was. And it's like, nobody will ever find it. You know, it's just this one random IP address somewhere. Ain't nobody looking for me. It'll be fine. And I tried to explain port scanning and the whole nine, and he just was unwilling to believe that somebody would come find his machine and do a bad thing. And so he kept ignoring my advice because it was convenient for him, and that seemed like it was fine, and he didn't even want to bother putting a password on it until one day he came home and he saw his mouse cursor moving around on the screen, clicking stuff, opening things, doing just random nonsense. It didn't look like whoever it was really had a plan. They were just dicking around, but he literally yanked the power cord out of the back of his computer instantly. And then when he turned it back on without the network cord plugged in and uninstalled VNC completely. And, only then did he plug everything back in. And he told me about it later. And I do have to give him credit for that. Like he told me about it after it happened. Like he told me the whole story, and props to him because that would be very tempting to just go to your grave never admitting.
Did you teach him about Nmap after that then?
I'd already taught him about Nmap. He just didn't believe me.
Exchange Server SE to debut just before 2019 support ends.
Yeah, this one is interesting. So until now, if you had big email server on a Microsoft network, self-hosted or whatever, you would pay for a license for Microsoft Exchange Server, which was a big honking bit of software you run on your big Windows server machine, and it would provide an email server. And as with typical Microsoft software, it has a support lifetime, and every couple of years you have to buy the newer version. Now they're transitioning to Exchange Server SE, as in subscription edition, which will charge you every month instead.
Monthly recurring revenue, eh?
Yeah. Now the real kicker here is their promise is that when Exchange Server SE releases later this year, just in time to provide you a little bit of time to upgrade before 2019 goes out of support, it will contain exactly the code as the 2019 versions with the latest patch level. So you will now start paying a monthly recurring fee for the same software with no improvements. Now, they claim they will continue to maintain it and maybe add features and improvements, but for the first couple of months, for sure, you're going to be paying a subscription for no new features.
I think the timing is also really suspect on this. The way they're waiting until the last possible moment to even offer it. I mean, you can't sign up now. You're not going to be able to sign up until eventually. It's like hurry and rush to sign up and do the thing, or you're out of support. And what that smells like to me is I just don't know how much longer on-premises Exchange is even going to be a thing. I don't think Microsoft is enthusiastic about it. I think Microsoft has gotten to the point where they're like, why the hell aren't you using Office 365 and letting us manage all of it for you on the cloud where it makes so much more sense, yada, yada, yada. And I think it's just another nail in the coffin of like proper federated email. The big players have decided at this point that email should be more like direct messaging on a large social media platform. Like there shouldn't be more than 2 or 3 players. And I don't know that slide is really going to reverse at this point. It makes me a little sad.
Yeah, and I have concerns about it as well, partly because the cutouts that Online Exchange has for self-hosted is how my email currently works. So while we have our email in hosted Office 365, we tell it we have an on-prem Exchange that is actually my postfix server and allows all the email that we generate from Unix machines to go and be delivered by Exchange 365 because it's the only way to guarantee that it might actually be accepted by other hosts on the internet. And if they get rid of the idea of hosted Exchange, they will probably cut out our ability to relay our email through an authenticated portal like that.
Can I play a bit of devil's advocate here? What you described, Alan, is you're going to move to a subscription service for essentially what you already had before, with patches and maintenance, and maybe occasional new features here and there. That sounds to me like a sustainable software development model.
And if you were talking about Windows, I would agree with you. But we're not. We're talking about a mail server. And there are maybe 3 real big players in the email game anymore. One is Microsoft, one is Google, and the third is whatever unholy conglomeration that ends up being Yahoo or branded AT&T or whatever, like a million different ISPs are using what amounts to Yahoo garbage. Those are really pretty much it for the big players. I mean, obviously, you've also got your Proton Mail and your Fast Mail. There are several niche commercial players.
And Apple is a big one.
That's true, that do a really good job. But ultimately, email has really shaken its way out of its original federated setup into like, if you're not one of the big boys, you don't get to play. And I think that the big boys like it that way. And yeah, when I see something like this and I see the least possible effort to put some kind of a continuation plan in at the last possible second, what I don't see is, oh good, they're moving to a sustainable model. What I see is they really don't care about this. They're barely even willing to do this much. And pretty soon it's probably going to be a case of, oh, you want email? No problem. Just throw us money. And that all happens in the cloud. And you don't have to worry about it. And it's great.
It does feel like at some point they'll be like, well, you're already paying us a subscription. Why are you paying for hardware anymore when you could just have us do it? But to Joe's point, yes, I think subscriptions sometimes are a better model for software licensing, but I would expect in the transition that I get something in exchange for my subscription. Not, oh, the subscription version is just the same as the last update from months ago and no promise that we're actually going to continue to improve it or anything. It's just, we're going to take what you already have and now charge you monthly for it and purposely break the old one so you can't keep using it.
Well, are they not going to keep an eye on CVEs and all that stuff like we talked about on Linux Dev Time?
Yes, but generally during a transition like this, like when Adobe switched to their online model for Photoshop and so on, you got the new version, not just the old version in exchange for money. Like you were paying for something.
But what are you going to add to a mail server that's new in terms of features in 2024?
Quite a bit. AI. Not that I want that in my mail server.
Oh. Yeah, we definitely want that, don't we? Yeah.
Also, more to the point, I think, subscription models can be a little scary when you're talking about an on-premises mail server because how does that work? Not only today, but in the future. Like at what point does Microsoft start saying, you know what? You would spend a lot less money paying at the subscription rate for an Exchange server with your number of users than you would to host the same number of users on Office 365. So we're going to go to a per mailbox model for that, even when it's on-prem, just because we can. It'll make some more money. We like money.
Yeah. Or if your connection to our server doesn't work for a couple hours, we're going to stop letting you have email or something, right? Like if it can't confirm you have a subscription, what's it going to do?
But was this not always the risk of using Microsoft's email server instead of something like XIM or Postfix?
It's one of a million. I think the biggest risk that I found personally is that Exchange doesn't use a sensible storage format like Maildir. It's essentially giant inbox blobs in a cut down version of Microsoft SQL Server, and it corrupts really easily. And if a user's mailbox gets corrupted with 10 gigs of email in it, you lost access to all 10 gigs of email in one fell swoop, which happened to, I lost track of how many customers that I migrated off of Exchange and either to a cloud-based service or to, back in the day, a proper Linux-based or FreeBSD-based mail server that did have sane, sensible storage that was easier to back up and more difficult to corrupt and more recoverable and, all these good things.
If you were lucky, volume shadow copy meant that your backup software could take a backup of some semi-consistent version of that database. Although every user's database would be from a different time during the same backup.
Also, are we not going to talk about how frequently the VSS writer for SQL and SQL-like services would just fail to work properly, and when it did not complete its task, then you just didn't get any volume shadow copy at all? Because that's another thing I've long since lost count of, is how many Microsoft servers I've seen with some form of SQL Server on them that the VSS writer failed, and so you just stopped getting any volume shadow copies.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Tailscale. Go to tailscale.com/25A. Tailscale is an intuitive, programmable way to manage a private network. It's zero-trust network access that every organization can use, and with Tailscale's ACL policies, you can securely control access to devices and services with next-gen network access controls. Loads of the late-night Linux family hosts use Tailscale for all sorts, including controlling 3D printers, remoting into their relative systems for support, controlling Home Assistant, and sending ZFS snapshots to off-site backup locations. I got it set up in minutes, and you can too. So support the show and check out Tailscale for yourself. Go to tailscale.com/25A and try out Tailscale for free for up to 100 devices and 3 users with no credit card required. That's tailscale.com/25A. Something we don't plug nearly enough is Practical ZFS, or ZFS as you say, your discourse forum, Jim, which is for Reddit refugees. And recently someone there was struggling with ZFS boot menu.
So technically, the new user we're talking about really wasn't having a problem with ZFS boot menu itself at all. What they were having a difficulty with was a very low-level installation of their distro of choice, which happened to be Ubuntu. I could have done, frankly, a much better job of outlining this potential pain point for people when we first started plugging ZFS boot menu. I said that it's super easy to get going with ZFS boot menu, and that part is true. However, it does require that you jump down to the command line and do a debootstrap-based installation of Debian or Ubuntu, or similarly, very low-level installs, from the command line, scripted on whatever distribution of choice you're using. And that tends to result in an incredibly minimal installation that's missing a lot of the creature comforts that a lot of people expect and were frankly unaware that it was possible to not end up with after an OS installation. And this particular user, the thing that threw them the hardest was they didn't have a working network stack after they got done. The operating system booted just fine, but they couldn't get to the internet or anywhere else because having done a very minimal debootstrap install, they didn't have an automatically generated YAML file for NetPlan to tell their computer, this is how you go ahead and get a DHCP address for your network interface. Now, if you're a veteran sysadmin, this kind of thing is not really going to be new to you. You understand how the network stack works. And if you don't have network access, you go, damn it, I got to go do that. I don't usually have to do that, but whatever. And you trundle off and you do it. If you're not a veteran system administrator, it can be incredibly disorienting to realize, I don't have a network stack. I don't have a graphical desktop. I'm missing 2 or 3 apps I just expect always to be there for me. I've never had to install myself. And the answers are usually pretty easy to get that going. For example, to get the graphical desktop on Ubuntu, it's literally a single command away, apt install ubuntu-desktop, and it pulls in everything you normally expect to get in a completely full-featured desktop interface, not only from the server distribution, which also comes headless by default, but it looks just like the actual desktop installer. The more important part to this particular user was just not knowing even how to get to the network. And luckily, they eventually managed to figure it out mostly for themselves after somebody else clued them in on it. And they went and figured out, okay, this is what the YAML file should look like, and just created a minimal YAML file to grab an address via DHCP, and everything was fine. But, having seen that and having, been one of the people participating and helping that user get on their feet, I felt like we should really revisit this on the show and mention that while ZFS boot menu itself is very easy, specifically low-level operating system installs and having to put in missing pieces afterwards, it's not actually ZFS boot menu, but those are difficulties that you need to be willing to deal with if and when you encounter them.
Yeah, I've seen similar issues using DE Bootstrap to install a Debian or a Ubuntu-based jail on FreeBSD, and then being like, oh, yeah, I guess it doesn't come with all the same packages that a full Ubuntu install would come with by default.
All the same packages are available. They're just not all already automatically installed the way they are when you run through the full fat installer. And debootstrap is more minimal even than the minimal server install on Ubuntu. It is stripped down. The hilarious thing is, this is not the first time I've been through this. I wrote the original guides that most people used to get FreeBSD operating systems running on a ZFS root back in the day in like version 7 and 8, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And back then, it was pretty much the same way with FreeBSD. You had to trigger an installation from the command line after you already had a shell to create your pool and do all the other nonsense. And again, you wound up with an extremely minimal system that you then had to put missing pieces back in. This tended not to throw people quite as badly in the FreeBSD world because, no offense, Alan, FreeBSD is a lot more likely to leave holes there in the first place. And FreeBSD users tend to be more accustomed to the idea that there's going to be work I have to do, whereas most of the Linux distributions tend to be more user-friendly. Again, I doubt anybody who's already an Arch user is going to have any kind of hiccups in their game if they do a ZFS boot menu install. But for the Ubuntus and even the Debians of the world, yeah, you may need to learn a couple of things about your distribution.
Yeah. One thing that surprises most people when they're used to Linux and come to FreeBSD is even if you use the installer and do a full install, if you look at the list of packages that are installed after, it's, would you like to install the package manager? There are no packages by default, and even the package manager is not installed by default, but that's mostly so it can be updated outside of the distro itself. But then you can go and add whatever you want. But yeah, it's quite a different experience for people that aren't expecting it.
The other big thing that I would recommend that anybody look at and make sure of anytime they do this kind of very low-level OS install, whether ZFS boot menu is underneath it or not, but just basically if you're doing one of these super low-level installs and you're not that familiar with it, one of the biggest things you want to make absolutely certain of before you walk away from that machine is you may expect the SSH daemon to automatically be up and running after a fresh system install, and it might not be when you're doing one of these minimal type installs. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Do yourself a favor, do a PSWWAUX, or literally just try to shell in from another machine and make sure it's answering and you can actually get in.
Yeah.
Assuming you want to get into the machine remotely, but I don't think there's that many Linux users, and certainly not that many Linux users that are listening to 2.5 admins who don't expect to be able to shell into a box.
Again, circling back to FreeBSD, even though it's not really related here, a lot of people are also surprised by the fact that on FreeBSD, by default, you cannot SSH as root. So if you didn't add an extra user and put them in the group 0, which is called wheel on FreeBSD rather than root, if you add a user and you can SSH as them, you still can't SU to root until you are in that group as well. And so, yeah, it's very easy to leave yourself locked out. So you do have to look at these steps and understand what's happening.
As long as we're on the topic of practical ZFS, I will also mention that one of the most common paper cuts that's been reported to me is that if you went just to practicalzfs.com and not discourse.practicalzfs.com, you got a certificate mismatch. That's because Discourse wants to be deployed via Docker, and so it's kind of hard to monkey around in there, and not a real good idea to monkey around inside the Docker instance. And so I just pointed both the bare name and discourse.practicalzfs.com to the Docker, and you can't really control what that certificate is set up for, so people would get a certificate mismatch. Well, I finally just went ahead and pointed practicalzfs.com and www.practicalzfs.com to a separate VM with its own vhost that does nothing but redirect you where you need to go, and so no more certificate mismatch. Eventually, I plan to have quite a bit of articles and documentation and various other resources available when you just go to practicalzfs and not discourse. But for the meantime, at least people will stop seeing scary security warnings.
Let's do a quick bit of feedback. Oliver writes, I just listened to the episode where Pablo asked for help with an increase in ads after enabling IPv6. I suspect he might be doing some DNS-based ad blocking with Pi-hole or something like you mentioned. However, I had the same issue and tracked it down to my router setting itself by default as the DNS server on IPv6, meaning that my Pi-hole wasn't being used on IPv6.
That is an excellent point, and that brings us back to one of my big complaints I've mentioned just about every time we talk about IPv6, which is you have a completely separate set of configs, and there's just not really any way to reconcile that. So you can say, well, I want the exact same policies on IPv4 as IPv6. You can't really do it. You've got to recreate it in its entirety. That means any DHCP settings, any DNS stuff, any firewall rules, it's all got to get managed independently, which makes a hybrid network where you've got both IPv4 and v6 access a nightmare.
Yeah, IPv6 was designed partly to not need something like DHCP. Although it turns out DHCP is very useful for a lot of policy stuff. And so there is a whole DHCP v6 thing, but it's really not the default. And then, yeah, if you're using the IPv6 default router advertisement mechanism, then yeah, it can end up advertising a different DNS server than your v4 traffic. And then suddenly you're not controlling things or filtering things the way you thought you were.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Tobias writes, how should I approach learning a topic I'm so unfamiliar with that I don't even know how to start learning?
Well, the way that I did it back in my larval days is I would go down to the local Barnes & Noble and head down to the Tech Bible section and peruse their stack of $60 to $100 Tech Bibles, and I would just buy one on the topic I was interested in. And for the next anywhere from a week to a month, every time I went to take a crap, that's what I'm reading on the toilet. And the idea was not to work through the book or to use the book as a permanent reference. It was just to get me that 10,000-foot overview. Like once you've just read through that book, like you don't have to quiz yourself. You don't have to get everything. Just read the pages. And like once you're done, you'll have a better idea of whether you actually want to do that thing, whether it's DNS or email or whatever. And B, now you'll know enough to be able to use a search engine to find online documentation that's a lot more current and relevant and searchable and indexed and to the point. That's what you use for your actual working reference. But for getting that 10,000-foot overview, man, you can't beat that $60 Tech Bible.
Yeah, I'd say for me, a big part of it is about being able to maintain the motivation. And so that's usually find some problem that you want to solve with it. And then you're going to be able to, when you have a more clear end goal in mind, then you can go through figuring out which parts you don't know and, do up to the point where you hit something you don't know how to do and then go figure it out. But it's a lot harder to do anything kind of completely undirected. So having some concrete goal that you can break down steps to get to can make it a lot easier.
I agree with that completely. And that's also what I do. It just, I interpreted Tobias's question as, what do I do if I'm so clueless I don't even have a goal, but I'd still like to learn something about the thing, maybe figure out a goal. And that's where that $60 Tech Bible came in for me.
And a lot of those nowadays come with an ebook version that is searchable, since it's not the 90s anymore.
Did you just call me old, you bastard?
Yep.
Yeah, goal like I want to install a WordPress blog on a VPS. That's going to force you to learn a few things. You can go for the one-click thing, which is just easy. But if you want to just go from a ground-up installation of Ubuntu or Fedora or whatever, and then get that up to a point where you've got a working WordPress blog, you're going to end up learning a bunch of stuff in the meantime. Or maybe you want to set up a Jellyfin server and get hardware acceleration working. You're probably going to have to learn about Docker to do that. It's just about finding that thing, as Alan said, find the motivation to actually solve a problem and learn the thing that you need to learn to solve it.
Well, the thing that's going to keep you stuck to it even when it's hard.
Yeah.
Or annoying or where you're not entirely sure what to do.
On the other hand, if all you know about Docker is all of your IT friends keep talking about Docker and you barely even know what the hell it is, well, that's where you're going for the 10,000-foot overview. And then for something like Docker, it's so all-pervasive, especially in the 2020s. You don't necessarily have to go buy a Bible. You can find just somebody's random crap and read through it online, most likely. But again, if you don't know enough about it to have a goal to chase or a problem to solve yet, just go for that 10,000-foot overview. Don't beat yourself up. Don't treat it like school, like I have to study this, I have to be able to pass a quiz. No, none of that. Just go straight through it, and whatever you retain is whatever you retain. But when you're done, you will have retained enough to have a framework to know, okay, this is something I might like to do. This is something that I want to learn. This is how I want to go about this thing.
Or these are the terms I need to search for when I'm looking for this specific part of it. And exactly, enough vocabulary to actually be able to ask questions about it.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.